I love that one. I just love that one. I'd like to begin this morning by saying goodbye. Now, don't be alarmed or hopeful. Excuse me. My throat may say goodbye. I'm not going anywhere. I just wish to say goodbye. Not au revoir or auf Wiedersehen. Not adios or arrivederci. Not ciao or tschüss. Not even farewell or see you. Goodbye. That is all. You may have been surprised for a moment. You may have been confused or puzzled. After all, goodbye is something we say towards the end, when we are departing a place, not something we begin with. So whatever, excuse me, we'll have to re-record the first part of this. So whenever we may have thought or felt, so whatever you may have thought or felt when I began with goodbye, I'm willing to bet that none of you was offended. Although I may yet succeed in offending someone before we get to the point this morning where I echo the Saturday morning cartoons of my childhood and say, that's all, folks. Words are curious things. While they are always filled with meanings, from the mundane to the profound, our reaction to specific words can be charged with emotion. On the one hand, or devoid of emotion on the other. Sometimes how we feel about certain words is relative to the context in which they are used. Nowhere is this more true than in the fields of politics and religion, where the deployment of words may spark joy or offense, moving people towards accord or violence. Nowhere are words more fraught with emotion and misunderstanding, which brings me back to goodbye. Words can communicate meaning and understanding, and sometimes they can get in the way. Etymologists generally agree that the word goodbye entered the English language as a contraction of the phrase, God be with you, and that it was first recorded in the late 16th century, although its current form didn't become standardized until the 18th century, which isn't all that long ago. It is thought that God transformed into good owing to the influence of the expressions good day and good night, which emerged in the 13th and 14th centuries, respectively. Unlike many of the false etymologies that abound about other words, the metamorphosis of God be with you into goodbye can be easily documented through written sources, not least of all Shakespeare. But seriously, does the uncontracted phrase even come to mind when you say goodbye to someone? Their departure may bring you sadness or delight, or varied emotions in between. But the word itself is unlikely to offend you, unless it's uttered by someone with whom you've been quarreling. Even atheists say goodbye. Some might argue that this is a trivial illustration of how the meanings of words change, especially how a word or expression rooted in religious belief might transform into one that is used in a secular, everyday manner. And they would be correct. That's why I chose it. Precisely because it's rather trivial, and therefore not charged with emotion. But I can promise you that if I were to begin saying God be with you every time we parted from one another, or ended my sermons with God's blessings upon you, tongues here would soon begin to wag. The people would murmur about the minister, and most of you would begin looking forward to my last sermon, that is, to saying goodbye. The vocabulary of religious faith once seemed dead to me, writes Kathleen Norris, who conceded that even after returning to church, I'd run into barriers, words that seemed like mental roadblocks. This is a familiar territory for many of us. Sacred words may scare us, and religious jargon even offend us, or perhaps do nothing for us at all, like that song from the movie and play chorus line, where one of the characters sings nothing because that was exactly what she felt. Why do we react to some religious words the way we do? How do we express the ineffable without them? Is religious vocabulary dead or just sleeping? Unitarian Universalists are sensitive about words. Some would say hypersensitive. Most of the time, though, it's a good thing. Being as precise as we can in the words we use enhances communication and understanding. Although there's still something to be said for cultivating ambiguity in certain situations. Politicians and preachers both rely on a robust degree of ambiguity at times. So do parents and friends when the so-called whole truth is too harsh to bear. Ask me how you look today, and there's an excellent chance I will lie. Well, not you, but others. Ask me how I feel today, and there's also a good chance that I will lie to spare you the bother of having to listen to my tale of woe. And yet I appreciate clarity of meaning, and most of the time I strive to say what I have to say as plainly as possible without giving gratuitous offense to anyone. And like anyone else who isn't stuck in time or encumbered by excessive ideology, the language I use has evolved over time. I try to avoid gendered language when gender isn't relevant, and when it may be, I strive to remain balanced. I believe that pronouns are important, as all identities overall, so I try to be respectful of the identities of others, although I sometimes slip. As a general rule, I think it's more than enough to understand myself accurately without presuming to define others. Wherever I find myself, and whoever I find myself with, I seek to be inclusive and kind. I don't speak the same way I did when I was a teenager, a younger man, and there are things that I may have said in the company of this very congregation just 40 years ago that I wouldn't repeat today, which makes me abidingly grateful that I grew up in an age without clandestine recording and social media. All that said, I maintain that Unitarian Universalists and liberal-minded people in general fuss about words as much as fundamentalists do, though the words we fuss over tend to be different. And when they are the same, we fuss about them from a different perspective. No group of people is immune to reactivity and the temptations of literalism. I do understand that words can be triggers, and because words are a means of exploring ideas and values, it's wise to avoid those that close off discussion before it even begins. You can't make a friend by saying things in such a way that they won't talk with you. Not surprisingly, perhaps, some Unitarian Universalists are easily triggered by conventionally religious words. including the word religion itself. The words I've seen trigger some Unitarian Universalists are in alphabetical rather than emotive order: benediction, church, faith, God, grace, hymn, prayer, salvation, spirituality, and worship. Thank you, Norm, for your bravery earlier today. This list is not exhaustive. It's just the top 10. I'll concede there are words and expressions that trigger me too. So please don't assume I'm just wagging my finger at others. But my list is unlike that of many, probably most, Unitarian Universalists. And it consists primarily of words and expressions that strike me as jargon or not so clever euphemisms to avoid some other words. Mostly, they just don't speak to me in any meaningful way, although in some cases they can annoy me. For example, and this is an example of not speaking to me in a meaningful way, I find that the expression beloved community rings hollow to me, no matter how profound some may feel it is. And you will never, ever hear me use the word beloved as a noun rather than an adjective, unless a couple I'm about to marry insists on their wedding ceremony beginning with dearly beloved. In that case, I'll defer to their wishes. But do know that the relative position of my eyebrows on such occasions isn't just a twitch. I'm generally unmoved when the words deep or sacred are deployed in an effort to enhance the significance of an otherwise everyday word. Although I will violate, or is it provoke, my own reactivity more than once during the course of this sermon. I wince at the certainty with which Unitarian Universalists describe their social justice work as prophetic, since it strikes me as hubris. I prefer Yuletide to Christmas, and I resist the appropriation of alternative words from religious traditions we dabble in, but neither understand nor embrace, simply because we aren't allergic to those ones. Overall, I use conventional religious terminology sparingly, but I don't avoid it, and I won't avoid it, because we don't practice our particular way in religion. Some might say peculiar, while others would object to religion. But I don't think we practice our particular way in religion in isolation from others, from the larger community. We exist within a larger culture of religious traditions, and sometimes it is expedient, if not actually necessary, to use the language of the larger society if we are to be understood beyond our own walls. Now, I could go on at length about each of the 10 words I mentioned earlier, but I know that some of you are already wishing I would say goodbye again. So I will address just 2 of them: worship and spirituality. I do so primarily to demonstrate that our emotional reaction to words is not necessarily aligned with the roots and meanings of those words, but rather influenced by the dogmatic assertions of those religions and their practitioners who are intent on narrowly defining the life out of them. And I might add, those without any religion or practice who are similarly intent on narrowly defining the life out of them. As it happens, my main focus in graduate school was on the psychology of Unitarian Universalist worship, and this congregation was even the subject of one of the experiments I conducted, which culminated in the Collegium Lecture in Theology at the 1990 General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association in Milwaukee. Yes, those of you who were here during the ministries of John Gilbert and Bill Hauff were laboratory mice for part of my research. In my lecture, all those years ago, I said, all humans worship in some sense or another, whether they recognize it or not. The word itself comes from the Old English worthskippen, which simply means to shape worth or denote a condition of worth. So one can be said to worship in its broadest sense whenever one sees and shapes the worth of some value, idea, activity, or object. Whenever one sits in awe before the stars or a child, one may well be worshiping. When a congregation gathers to worship, it does so in the belief that its members can, as a religious community, shape worth together. Divorced from theology and dogma, worship can be seen simply as a form of behavior. Call it what you will, a service or an assembly or a meeting. Worship remains a valid word to describe what is happening, even if it's not a word that a particular individual or congregation chooses to use. Worship doesn't belong to a particular sect, nor does it necessarily involve prostrating oneself before a particular deity, be it God or Elvis. It is a word with deep roots in the English language, dating long before the religious colonization of the British Isles by Christianity. A similar argument can be made for spirituality, although in this case, I'll leave its defense to Carl Sagan, the eminent scientist and humanist. Noting that the word spirit comes from the Latin word to breathe, Carl Sagan was comfortable with the idea of spirituality, even though his understanding of it ran contrary to what many people mean when they use the word. Despite usage to the contrary, he wrote, there is no necessary implication in the word spiritual that we are talking about anything other than matter, including the matter in which the brain is made, or anything outside the realm of science. On occasion, I will feel free to use the word. Science is not only compatible with spirituality, it is a profound source of spirituality. The notion that science and spirituality are somehow mutually exclusive does a disservice to both. Sagan used the term to describe a quality of depth in the human experience that is ineffable, but entirely natural. Instead of immediately reacting to the words our companions use, either to embrace them or dismiss them, we are always better served when we seek to understand what they mean by them. In doing so, we will sometimes discover that we may have been pre-offended on the one hand, or that we assumed we were in agreement on the other, when in fact we were talking past one another. Words, especially religious words, words that have to do with deep things, get tired and stale the way people do, wrote Frederick Buechner. Find new words, or put old words together in combinations that make them heard as new. Make you yourself new, and make you understand in new ways. Arrange the alphabet into words that are true in the sense that they are true to what you experience to be true. Even so, Buechner later conceded that the words of faith, and one could add any philosophical words, point to the realm of mystery and depth that lies beyond our ordinary experience. That's why I believe that religious words still have currency, even though we may use them sparingly and sometimes even retire them altogether. Even then, they're not dead. They're just sleeping. And one never knows when they might be awakened again to serve some purpose after they have been cleansed of whatever negative connotations they may have once held, whatever connotations we may have brought to them, rather than what they may have inflicted upon us. It's up to congregations to discern the words that work for them and the words that don't. And wise discernment involves first understanding what those words mean and how they can both inform and obscure meaning. But just as liberal democracy involves majority rule with minority rights, liberal religious communities need to leave room for as wide a vocabulary as conditions allow. It is not up to any of us to impose words upon others, although we should feel free to use whatever words we find meaningful ourselves, even as we endeavor to be respectful of one another. It's a delicate balancing act. And if you will allow me to use the word, it takes grace to navigate it. That's all, folks. That's this morning's pontification, and I'm sticking to it. The closing hymn is number 1064. Oh, am I? 1062. Oh, 1052. I'll get it